March 3, 1940. London, England. The sound of boots echoed in the dim light of the Royal Navy's war room. Officers, their faces strained with the relentless weight of war, clustered around charts, muttering numbers and debating strategies. Outside, the night was bitter, and the only sound was the wind scraping against the cold walls of the Admiralty. But inside, the murmurs carried the palpable tension of a looming crisis no one could yet name. The British Navy was invincible. It was the spine of the empire, its dominance unquestioned. Yet beneath the surface, something unseen and unspoken was eroding that certainty. The German U-boats had become the stuff of nightmares, haunting the channels and coasts like ghosts that could never be caught, never be understood. Allied merchant ships and war vessels were sinking at an alarming rate, each lost ship a wound, a scar on the heart of Britain's naval pride. Yet for all the intelligence reports, for all the intercepted messages, the Admiralty was blind to the real cause. In their haste to respond, they threw more ships into the fray, launched more depth charges, sent more men into harm's way, all while the true threat slipped past them, unnoticed. The sea, with all its vast, shifting mystery, was proving more treacherous than the enemy themselves. And worse, the Navy, for all its might, had no way of seeing what was beneath them. In a small corner of the London docks, far from the political games and military strategies, Jack O'Connor was at work. A dockworker, no officer or spy. He was simply a man who knew ships, how they creaked and groaned under the weight of war, how the water licked against their hulls like a hungry beast. It was a far cry from the shiny uniforms of admirals or the brave sailors who manned the decks. His life was built from rusted bolts and timber planks, from the scent of grease and salt water, the sounds of hammering and welding. But it was here, in the shadows of these forgotten ships, that he began to see a pattern, a dangerous pattern. He'd been fixing and maintaining warships for months, after the early days of war had drained the Navy's manpower. But it wasn't the work that struck him, it was the wrecks. Time and again, Jack would stand before these shattered hulks, try to figure out what had taken them down. These weren't just accidents or simple navigational errors. No, something was wrong, something hidden. There were marks on the hulls, strange, jagged wounds, that seemed to appear out of nowhere, as though the ship had been struck by something beneath the waves. It started with the smallest clues. A sailor's journal. The murmurings of survivors who spoke not of enemy ships or artillery fire, but of something far more insidious. Silent, invisible killers that struck from below, too fast, too quiet to be heard until it was too late. Mines, not the heavy, clumsy ones that could be defused with a little luck or skill, but something far worse, something far more precise. A German U-boat captain had once claimed that their ships operated with the utmost secrecy, and Jack, no fool, had pieced together what they had meant. There was a gap in the Navy's knowledge, a huge blind spot, a place where the fleet's intelligence systems had no reach. The Germans had perfected a new kind of weapon, one that could sink a ship without ever revealing its position. Mines, designed to be undetectable by conventional sonar, capable of slipping past even the most advanced detection systems. In the dead of night, they would wait beneath the surface, hidden by the shifting tides, the stealth of the sea itself. No one was talking about it. The Admiralty's intelligence reports were filled with speculation, but lacked any concrete answers. The crews of the sunk ships were often in the dark, unable to provide any real details about the attacks. The notion of something lurking in the deep, waiting to strike, seemed too fantastical to believe. But Jack had seen it, in the twisted wreckage, in the broken hulls, and in the eyes of the men who had survived only to tell stories that nobody believed. There was something strange, something terrifying about the way these ships had been sinking. They weren't being hit by enemy fire in the traditional sense. It was as though they were being pierced by something invisible, something that the Navy had no defense against. The more Jack thought about it, the clearer it became. These attacks weren't random. They were the result of a precise, deliberate strategy, a strategy that the Admiralty had failed to recognize. In the days that followed, Jack's mind became consumed with the thought of how to fight back. He wasn't a soldier, nor a scientist. He was a man who spent his days with tools and machinery, yet he knew the ships better than anyone. He began to take meticulous notes, sketching out ideas on scraps of paper. Every time a ship was brought in for repairs, he inspected it with new eyes, searching for patterns, for clues that might reveal something that could save the others. And as he worked, a thought began to form, a simple, radical idea. It wasn't just the mines that were undetectable. It was the very sea itself, the way the ships moved through it, the way the waves betrayed them. If only they could detect the anomalies beneath the surface, if only they could understand the patterns of the water itself, they might have a chance. Jack began to experiment. Alone, often in the dead of night, he worked with whatever he could get his hands on: wires, metal scraps, and the little knowledge he had gleaned from years of working with machines. He was building something, a device, something that might help them understand what the Navy couldn't see, something that could expose the mines before they claimed more victims. But even as he worked in secret, doubts crept in. Would anyone listen to him? A dockworker with no official standing, no military rank. Would the Admiralty take him seriously, or would they dismiss him as just another civilian with a half-baked idea? Jack didn't know, but he couldn't stop. He had seen too many ships sink, too many lives lost to something that might be stopped. He had to try. In the cold, quiet darkness of the war room, officers continued to argue over strategy, and the ships continued to sink. But somewhere in the vast expanse of the dockyards, one man was preparing to change the course of the war, and he had no idea that no one would ever recognize it. August 15th, 1941. Liverpool, England. The dockyards were a place of constant motion, of men hauling, machines clanking, and ships groaning as they were pulled into dry docks for repairs. It was the kind of place where time seemed to bend, the air thick with salt and oil, where every task was done with grim efficiency. And in this relentless rhythm, Jack O'Connor worked with a singular purpose. It wasn't the routine of ship repairs that held his attention anymore, but something far more urgent. Jack had been tinkering with his idea for weeks now, pulling apart old radio equipment, experimenting with wiring, and using anything he could salvage to build his device. It was crude, almost laughably simple when compared to the vast machines of war being built across the empire. But to Jack, it was a lifeline, a beacon of hope for the ships that had been slipping beneath the waves without a sound, without a warning. He wasn't sure exactly what he was building, but he knew it had to work. He had been following the wrecks for months, documenting the strange patterns of destruction, and it had become painfully clear that something undetectable to traditional sonar was out there, waiting to strike. The enemy wasn't just submarines. It wasn't just the classic dangers that sailors had faced for centuries. It was something hidden in the depths of the sea, something silent. The mines, the new kind of underwater trap, were their killers, but nobody had yet found a way to prevent their devastating strikes. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the Liverpool skyline, Jack stood in front of a weathered warship, her hull scarred from the last assault. The admiral had called for repairs again, but this time, Jack wasn't thinking about patching up the ship. His eyes scanned the body of the vessel, his mind racing with calculations. It wasn't about fixing the damage. It was about preventing the next disaster. He needed to test his device, the one he had been building in secret. It was a primitive contraption, a makeshift detector, nothing like the polished systems used by the Navy. But it was his only chance. "Oi, Jack!" A voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Tom, one of the other dock workers, his face covered in oil and grime. "The lads are saying you're trying to build some kind of contraption. You got something up your sleeve? Or is it just a pile of junk?" Jack didn't turn. He kept his eyes on the ship, his hands adjusting the delicate wires of the device. "Something like that," he muttered. Tom stepped closer, a skeptical look crossing his face. "You do realize they've got experts working on this, right? You're just a dockyard man. What can you do that they haven't thought of?" Jack turned to him then, his gaze sharp. "You've seen the wrecks, Tom. You've seen the men that come back, shaken, not knowing what hit them. It's not the submarines. It's not the depth charges. It's something else, something we can't see. And I think I think I can find a way to see it." Tom didn't reply right away. He simply stared at Jack for a long moment before shaking his head. "If you're right, and this works, you'll be the one to save those men out there. But if you're wrong," Jack didn't need to hear the rest. He knew what Tom meant. If he was wrong, there would be no recognition, no glory, just failure and the cold silence of being forgotten. With a final twist of his wrist, Jack secured the last component of the device. It was a fragile thing, a patchwork of salvage parts and trial-and-error design. But it was ready. He wasn't sure it would work, not completely, but he had to try. The ship, silent and still, waited for its fate, and Jack could only hope his creation would give it a fighting chance. That night, under the dim glow of flickering lamps, Jack placed the device on the deck of the ship. The sea stretched out before him, black and infinite, like a waiting predator. He activated the machine, and for a moment, nothing happened. The machine hummed faintly, and Jack held his breath. The silence felt thick, almost oppressive. Then a soft beep, then another, and another. Each beep was followed by a subtle shift in the way the machine hummed, as if it were reading the water beneath it. Jack's heart skipped. He adjusted the device, calibrated it to detect even the faintest anomaly. Hours passed. Jack didn't move. He barely breathed. He was entranced, watching the device's readings, hoping for a sign that he wasn't wasting his time. Slowly, the machine began to register something. It was faint at first, a distant signal, but it grew clearer with each passing minute. There was something out there in the depths. The device was picking up the anomalies. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Jack's pulse quickened. This was it. He wasn't mad. He wasn't chasing shadows. His creation was detecting what had been invisible until now. The minds, the silent killers. And just like that, Jack O'Connor, a man with no military rank, no formal education, had found a way to see the unseen. His machine was working, but Jack wasn't foolish enough to celebrate. He knew the Navy would never believe him. The Admiralty had their own experts, their own protocols, their own way of doing things. Men like him weren't supposed to challenge that. Yet, as Jack stood on the deck, staring into the blackness of the sea, he couldn't shake the feeling that his discovery was both a triumph and a curse. He had done it. He had found a way to stop the destruction. But who would listen? Who would care? The next day, Jack took his device to the naval authorities. He was met with the same skepticism he had expected. The officers looked him over with detached disinterest, as though he were just another civilian with a wild idea. But Jack didn't back down. He insisted. He showed them the readings, the anomalies the device had picked up. He explained how the mines were not detectable by conventional sonar, and how his machine could pinpoint their location with unprecedented accuracy. They listened, but only out of duty. They took the device, examined it, and filed it away, much as they had with every other unofficial piece of equipment that had ever crossed their desks. They told him it was a novel idea, but that they needed more testing. The usual bureaucratic excuse. Jack knew it would go nowhere. He could already hear the whispers. Just another dockworker with an idea, nothing more. December 2nd, 1944. London, England. The war was coming to a close, but for the men who had fought it, the end was little more than another battle. There was no grand celebration, no applause for the sacrifices that had been made. The world was still reeling from the scars of conflict, and amidst the cheers for victory, there were those who had been forgotten. Jack O'Connor was one of them. The device he had built, the simple contraption that had saved so many ships from destruction, was now gathering dust in some unmarked corner of the Admiralty. The Navy had never truly acknowledged him. They had tested it, sure, but no one had ever claimed ownership of the idea. No medals, no recognition, no thanks. Just the cold, indifferent machinery of war grinding on, moving faster than any individual could. Jack's life had never been about glory. It had been about survival, for the ships, for the men, for the families who waited for them to return. But still, the silence that surrounded his invention gnawed at him. His mind was consumed with the question, why had they ignored him? Why had they dismissed a solution that worked? Why was the war effort so blind to the very people who had saved it? He stood in front of the pub in Liverpool, the familiar smells of fish and chips wafting in the air. The same place he had gone for a pint after a long day at the docks. But tonight it felt different. The city had changed, the mood was lighter, but there was a weight in Jack's chest that hadn't been there before. His invention had worked. He had given them something they couldn't ignore, but they had. The device had saved lives, no doubt about it. Merchant ships had sailed through waters once thought too treacherous to pass. Warships had avoided the deadly traps set by the enemy, and the Navy had grown stronger, more resilient in the face of relentless attacks. But still, no one spoke of Jack. No one said his name. He had become a ghost in his own story, a forgotten man who had altered the course of the war without ever receiving his due. His thoughts drifted back to the war room, to the officers who had looked at his device with such condescension. The same officers who, a year later, would stand before the press and give speeches about the great victory in the Atlantic. They would praise the Navy's ingenuity, its bravery, its advancements in technology. But there would be no mention of the dockworker who had outsmarted them all. No one would say that the real solution had come not from the polished halls of military command, but from a man who had known ships better than anyone. The thought stung. It was the silence that hurt the most. The way they had dismissed him, not just as a man, but as an idea. He had been nothing more than a cog in a machine that moved too fast for anyone to notice the people who powered it. His device had saved lives, but those lives had never known his name. They would never know who had stood in the shadows, watching the sea, piecing together fragments of wreckage, and dreaming up a solution where others had seen only failure. Jack sat down at the bar, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. The familiar sound of the jukebox in the corner filled the room, but it did nothing to drown out the thoughts in his head. He had built something that had worked. But where was the credit? Where was the recognition for the man who had saved the Navy? The door of the pub opened, and a few familiar faces walked in. Tom, one of the dock workers from those days, gave him a knowing smile before sliding into the seat beside him. "Oi, Jack, how's it been?" "Same as always," Jack replied with a grunt, his gaze fixed on the bar. "They're still not talking about it." Tom's face tightened. He knew exactly what Jack meant. "Not even a word, huh?" Jack shook his head. "Not a single one. I gave them something that could have changed the whole damn war, and now they're too busy handing out medals to men who didn't do a damn thing." Tom didn't speak for a long moment. He took a swig of his own drink and glanced over at the half-empty room. "You know what they say, don't you? It's always the ones who are forgotten that do the most." Jack snorted, bitterness creeping into his tone. "Forgotten? Hell, I don't even think they know I exist." Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had seen the toll this had taken on Jack, the quiet way his frustration had grown over the past few years. But Jack wouldn't let it show in front of others. Never one to complain. Always the silent worker who expected nothing in return. Yet now, the weight of being overlooked seemed to hang over him like a cloud. "You'll get your moment, Jack," Tom said, though there was little conviction in his voice. "You'll get your due."